Welcome back to our next module, this one kicking off our unit on the next branch of philosophy we're going to cover, called metaphysics. The individual and the work we're going to use to delve into metaphysics is St. Anselm of Canterbury, the famous author of The Proslogian and the ontological argument. So metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the questions around the nature of reality. What is this existence? What is this reality that we find ourselves in? We talk a lot about virtual reality, but besides the virtual world we might enter into, what about the world that we currently physically live in? So questions about what does it mean to be, questions of being, existence, what does it mean to exist in this world, questions of essence, what is our true essence as humans, and the connection between these things, being, essence, existence. This is really the work of metaphysics. Metaphysics can be understood in two ways: metaphysical monism and metaphysical dualism. Really, the difference is quite simple. Monism believes there's only one kind of reality. It's either physical, metaphysical materialism, or it's mental or spiritual, metaphysical idealism. It's not both. It's either physical or it's mental spiritualism. Metaphysical dualism is kind of a compromise. It holds that there are two kinds of realities: physical and non-physical, and that this captures the complexity of existence. So individuals such as St. Anselm, who we'll cover in this module, and later St. Aquinas, they're going to be found within this category of metaphysical dualism, that there is a physical reality, and there's also a non-physical or spiritual reality. And the interplay between the two helps us to understand what it means to be human. It also points to who is God and what is God as being, and what does it mean to exist as a human? What does it mean that God exists? So these kind of questions are able to be tackled because they are metaphysical dualists. So let's look at the actual person of St. Anselm. So St. Anselm was born in either 1033 or 1034 in Lombardy, Italy, the 11th century. He was a theologian. A theologian studied God and God's existence and who God is, and a philosopher. And as a philosopher, he is famously known as the father of scholasticism. Scholasticism is the philosophical school of thought that was based on theology and Aristotelian logic. So we talked about in a previous unit that Aquinas really was a proponent of the classicist philosophical tradition: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Well, St. Anselm really was the first to bring that classicist tradition into Judeo-Christian belief and into philosophy to create this version of philosophy called scholasticism. As such, we see in Anselm and Aquinas this move early on in the church's history to bring in reason, to bring in the rational sciences, and to undo this understanding that faith and reason don't work together, but rather, as we're going to see, especially later on in the Monologian, the Proslogian, the Reductio, that Anselm tries to argue for God solely from the point of reason, and Aquinas also takes up this argument. So it's important to note that in these figures we see theology and reason, faith and reason, really as working together, not as opponents. He later entered the Benedictine monastery in France, in Bec, France, and became a monk, and later became the abbot, who was the head of the monastery. His three famous works I just mentioned are the Monologian, the Proslogian, and the Reductio. The Monologian is really his first attempt at crafting an argument about who God is and his existence, really by looking at God's attributes solely based on reason, and basically arguing that there is an absolute or supreme norm by which all things can be judged against. And he calls this supreme or absolute or perfect norm God. And then he develops this argument into what is called the ontological argument for God. And that's really the main focus of his proslogian, and one of the main focuses of us today in terms of understanding metaphysics through the ontological argument. As we're going to see later on, Aquinas basically takes Anselm's argument for the supreme norm and makes it one of his 5 proofs for the existence of God. Later on, he's named Archbishop of Canterbury in England by William II Rufus, which is Latin for the Red, and he was the son of William the Conqueror. So it's interesting to understand that at this point we only have Christianity. There isn't yet a split in Christian denominations. Catholicism is pretty much is Christianity. Before the Great Western Schism between East and West. So Canterbury today, which is known as the Archbishop of Canterbury as an important seat in the Anglican tradition, was actually originally the seat of a Catholic archbishop, Saint Anselm. So let's delve into Anselm's arguments for God and how he sees God through a metaphysical lens in the Proslogian. So really the thesis of the Proslogian as it relates to who God is that Anselm defines God as this. It's a phrase. That then which nothing greater can be thought. In other words, God is that which is so great that we can't think of anything greater. This definition of God is really based on a premise that Anselm already accepts to be true. And that is that God is the foundation of all things. He's the perfect being. So again, remember I referred to the monologian. He had already kind of laid that framework in the monologian that God is his supreme norm, this perfect being. He is perfection, by which we can understand what it means to be perfect. In other words, the argument is you can't understand what perfection is if you don't have a model of perfection. In other words, you can't tell what an A+ paper is if such a thing as an A+ paper doesn't exist to begin with. So this is how Anselm understood God. So he's already working from this pre-understood conception of God. The Proslogian is then going to focus through his ontological argument on how does that work and why is that true. The thing we have to understand about this is the Proslogian is a result of Anselm's prayer life. So remember, prayer is the way that individuals communicate with God, and God communicates with individuals. And so Anselm didn't start the Proslogian in order to try to find logical grounds for God's existence. Rather, he's trying to come to know God in a manner of faith, in a manner of prayer. You'll read the Proslogian. When you read the Proslogian, it reads as a prayer, like Anselm is writing a letter to God, like he's talking to God. That's what prayer is. So it's not that he starts with logic. He starts with prayer and a prayer life with God. And then based on the conclusions that he reaches in his own prayer life, he then attempts to apply logic to it. So it's important to read the Proslogian with that context to understand, who's he talking to and what's he getting at. He's already working from a preconceived stance that God is the ultimate being, and now he's thinking, okay, now that I've reached that conclusion in prayer, how does that work logically? So ultimately, to understand Anselm's key point about God, understand this, that God is far greater than us. So anything that we can conceive of will fail to measure up to God unless that thing is God's own self-revelation in the form of a concept. So anything that we can conceive of will not measure up to God because God is the greatest thing. The only thing that will measure up to God is what God reveals about himself. So let's delve in then into the ontological argument. This is essentially the main argument that Anselm uses in his Proslogian to argue for God's existence. And it goes something like this. A lawhead in your textbook on page 340 breaks it down a different way into 6 principles, so you can also look there to get a different understanding of it. This is going to be the understanding that I've learned of the ontological argument. So we take X. So X is whatever is the thing that you're referring to. In this case, X is God. But for the sake of argument, we're going to say X. So X is that then which nothing greater can be thought. Therefore, either A, X exists only in our understanding and not in physical reality, or B, X exists both in our understanding and in reality. So A, either God exists only in our understanding, that we can conceive of God, but God is not real, or we're able to both think of God and God is real. The part of this ontological argument is that both A and B cannot be true at the same time. Something cannot only exist in our understanding and at the same time exist both in our understanding and reality. It's one or the other. So if A is true, in other words, if God only exists in our understanding and not in reality, then it doesn't follow that God is that then which nothing greater can be thought of. Because a thing that exists both in our understanding and in reality is greater than something that only exists in our understanding. In other words, if we can only think of God, but God is not real, then God is not the greatest thing that can be thought of, because the greatest thing that can be thought of and also is real. So a very basic example of this is a pencil is greater than a unicorn. We can think about a unicorn, but a unicorn is not real. We can think about a pencil, and a pencil exists in reality. We know it, we hold it. So therefore, a pencil is greater than a unicorn. Something that exists both in our understanding and in reality is greater than something that only exists in our understanding. Therefore, for X to truly be that then which nothing greater can be thought, B must be true. So if X is God, if God is truly that then which nothing greater can be thought, if God truly is the supreme norm, as Anselm puts forward, then God has to exist both in our understanding and in reality. Because again, something that exists in our understanding and in reality is greater than just something that exists in our understanding. So I have the argument written here in syllogism fashion, based off of our last unit. So really the argument is this. If God is truly the greatest being, far beyond all of us, and that then which nothing greater can be thought exists both in understanding and reality, then God must exist in both understanding and reality. So maybe a simple way of saying, because God is the greatest, God must exist not just in theory, but in reality. This is in part due to Anselm's understanding of concept, so the definition of a concept. So for Anselm, the concept of God does not exist merely in the mind, because the concept of something is linked to its existence. Concepts do not come from our minds, but they're rooted in things that exist external to us. In other words, for example, we can conceive or think of a pencil in our mind because it exists in reality. In a similar way, we're able to think about God because God exists. So a reverse way of understanding this, of thinking about this is, because something does exist, we are able to think about it. So because we're able to think about God and we have that ability, it points to God being real. And this is pretty similar to the idea of the natural law that we've covered before. The idea that we can come to know about truth by using our reason. And so similarly, we can come to know about God simply by using our reason, by looking at the world around us. We can come to see trends and universal truths, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, that there are objective moral values that we can just come to know throughout existence. So this is a similar train of thought that Anselm is using. That because we can come to know something through our reason, then it points to its existence. However, he recognizes that this argument really only works when dealing with perfection. We're going to see later on a counter argument that was posed to this idea of, well, just because I can think of it doesn't mean that something is true. And Anselm recognizes that to an extent. However, he says when dealing with absolutes, when dealing with perfection, that than which nothing greater can be thought, the greatest thing possible, then this concept works for that. Because kind of as I explained before, this is getting into Aquinas's argument for God's existence. How can we know that such a thing as perfection exists if we don't have a model of perfection? How do we know what it means to be a great soccer player if there have not been great soccer players to show us? How do we know what a good answer looks like if such a thing as a good answer doesn't exist? How do we know what perfect beauty is, or that beauty exists if there isn't a supreme model of beauty? So it's all pointing back to these degrees of perfection point to perfection itself. So in a similar way, because we can, if God is the supreme norm of perfection, because we can conceive of it, God is real when dealing with the idea of perfection. In a different way too, going back to this idea of Anselm in his prayer life, this had big implications for him as a man of faith and as a theologian and as a bishop, because it meant that God, the conception of God, was really rooted in God, not merely something made up in our minds. In other words, for the theologian who is trying to come to know God and study God, it means we really can know who God is. We can know things of God. And that's really important for the theologian. But for our purposes here, it simply suffices to know that for Anselm, concepts are concepts, not simply because we can think of them, but we're able to think about concepts because those concepts actually exist. And so the fact that we are able to think about God is true because God exists. So objections to this ontological argument. Famously, and we'll explore him in a couple modules, Immanuel Kant, another philosopher in the metaphysical tradition, was perhaps one of the most prominent opponents of Anselm's argument, mainly because Kant was really influenced by the existentialist view that existence is merely an accident of being. Existence is not an additional attribute of being. It doesn't add anything to the idea of being. And so being for existentialists is really the essence of a thing. Existence does not significantly add anything to the idea of being. And so he takes issue with the idea that existence makes a thing greater than a merely possible thing. Because Anselm takes so much time to argue that because God exists in understanding and exists in reality, that he is the greatest thing, Kant's going to take issue with this importance placed on existence. And we'll delve into a little bit of that once we get to Kant. Galileo, who was another monk during Anselm's time, is perhaps one of the most famous critics of his time, particularly because he took the ontological argument and he makes this argument ad absurdum called the Lost Island. So he comes to this example, and you can see this in Lawhead on page 341, 342. The argument, well, if I can think of this perfect island with all these perfect attributes that are more perfect than any other island, then that island must exist. Well, Anselm responds to Guanilo in his work De Reductio, arguing that Guanilo really just took his example too far and out of context and tried to make it something it wasn't by applying the ontological argument to something that was clearly false, like a perfect island. In part because Anselm's going to argue that God is going to be unique to God's self, other than something like an island. Anselm's going to hold that something can exist somewhere and sometimes, but not everywhere and always. In other words, you can think of an island existing in one part of the world, but not being everywhere in the world at the same time. The island is not existence itself, it's only in a part of it. Likewise, Anselm holds that something can have parts that do not extend across all space and time. So in other words, you can think of the galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, being made up of planets and the sun and various different components of our galaxy, that these different parts make up the galaxy, but each individual part is not the entire galaxy. And so he's going to argue against this example of the lost island by saying, well, an island is not going to be everywhere always, and an island does not extend across all space and time. So he essentially is saying that he has a false syllogism. He's using a false premise and applying that false premise to the ontological argument. The reason why the ontological argument works for God is because it, again, only works with perfection, something that exists in everywhere in all times across all space and time, this perfect norm, and that is God to Anselm. So remember, Anselm's ontological argument only works because he's already accepted this idea of God as perfection, as God as this ultimate norm, of God as existing in everywhere and always across space and time. If you accept that premise, his argument then works. But you have to accept that premise first, that there is such a thing that can exist everywhere and always and across all space and time. Anything that doesn't exist everywhere and always and across all space and time, when you apply the ontological argument to it, it's not going to work. And in a manner that proves Anselm's argument for God, because the argument only works with God. So this is going to then point to what Anselm calls the necessity of God through what he refers to as necessary things versus possible things. So as a result to his response to Guanilo, he's going to argue that therefore the only thing that cannot be thought to not exist is that which exists in all times and places, not just some part of it, but entirely in every place and every time. For Anselm, this supreme being exists entirely at all times, in all places, and the supreme being is God. This points to God's omnipresence. He talks about this on page 88 in the Proslogian, after he defines this idea of that than which nothing greater can be thought on page 87. He says something which cannot be thought to not exist is greater than something that can be thought to not exist. It's kind of a double negative to prove a point. Basically, what this means is no one who has come to understand and believe that God exists can at the same time hold that God does not exist. Once you know that God exists, there's kind of no going back there once you have understood the rational warrant. And so Anselm thinks of God as a necessary thing, something that cannot fail to exist. Because, as he holds, as we just shared, in being a supreme being, God exists entirely in every place, in every time, across all times and places. Not sometimes in some places, and not just as a part. All times and places, and every time and place entirely. And so, therefore, Anselm can refer to God as a necessary thing as opposed to a possible thing, things that could exist. This is another way of simply underscoring the difference between those two options A and B in regards to X. That X, in being that than which nothing greater can be thought, can either be something that it exists only in understanding, the possible things, or understanding and reality, necessary things. And so there's another way to underscore Anselm's argument that God, in being that than which nothing greater can be thought, is a necessary things. That God, in being the supreme being, in being that which we cannot conceive of anything greater, therefore cannot fail to exist. He has to exist in reality. So we can think of something being a necessary thing, and therefore God must be a necessarily existing thing. As I mentioned before, this has great ramifications later on. St. Aquinas, we're going to cover in the next module, because Anselm was a very big influence on Aquinas. Aquinas most notably had these 5 proofs for God's existence. It uses rational warrant and reason to come to the conclusion that it's rational to believe that God is real. And really, his 4th argument, the supreme model or degrees of perfection, he really just takes from Anselm's ontological argument, that he reasons that there must be a supreme model of perfection in order for us to know what being perfect is. In other words, there must be a standard of measurement for perfection that is the ultimate perfection, the greatest standard of measurement, of which no greater measurement can be thought of. And since we can see through the world, through the natural law, we can see that different things have degrees of perfections, that there is good, better, and best in reality. Because there's these different degrees, then there has to be an ultimate degree. So another way of putting it is, because degrees of perfection exist, ultimate perfection must exist. Without ultimate perfection, without knowing what ultimate perfection is, we can't understand what the difference is between degrees of perfection. Again, this goes back to a teacher grading a paper. How do you know what counts as a D paper, a C paper, a B paper, an A paper, if you don't know what the criteria for an A paper is? You must have that standard of measurement. Similarly, let's take your module post for existence. I give you a grading criteria over content, clarity, development, and completeness, and what gets a 5 in those 4 categories. That there is a standard of measurement for your module posts, and that there is such a thing that defines what a perfect module post is, means that such a perfect post exists. Otherwise, there's no way to say, no, that's a 3 versus a 5, or that, development was a 2 versus a 5, or you got this wrong. The fact that we can say that things can be wrong points in reason to the fact that there is such a thing as a right. Because wrong exists, right exists. Because there's degrees of imperfection, there's perfection. Likewise, because perfection exists, we can have degrees of imperfection. This is all to say that these ultimate standards of measurement, these supreme models, these supreme norms, is an argument that Anselm first put forward and that Aquinas then takes to prove that God exists. Because we can think of the greatest possible thing that is God, God exists. And this is because Aquinas thinks that being is composite of essence and existence. And God's essence is his existence. And existence is integral to the very nature of being. So a thing's existence would have the ramification that Anselm thinks it does. So again, this gets back to the metaphysical questions of being and existence and how they connect to one another. Because who God is, his being, is that which nothing greater can be thought, then we can say that God exists. At least this would be Anselm's argument. So at this point, I'll direct you to the rest of the module materials and to our module post for this week.